40% of Ukrainians believe that their country is governed from abroad by Western curators and the so-called Soros allies. And this figure is actually bigger if you go to the southern Ukraine, to eastern Ukraine, to Donbass. In Donbass, about 61% believe this narrative. 39% of Ukrainians think that IMF, Western curators, Soros allies, would like to basically take their land, take Ukrainians' land, and govern it. So this is part of these so-called anti-Western conspiratorial narratives that we have studied in our report, and we will discuss on this discussion, on this event run by Ukraine World and Internews Ukraine. And I'm very happy to present our guests, which is basically a research team working on this study, and we are happy to discuss it with you. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I will moderate this discussion. I'm very happy to present Inna Borzilo, who is a co-founder of Public Journalism Interest Lab, a Ukrainian media NGO, which is very active in this field of public journalism idea. Very happy to present also people who are online. Peter Pomerantsev, a well-known scholar and book author, and one of the key team leaders of this report. Peter is in London, and this report has been prepared by the Arena think tank, as well as Public Journalism Interest Lab, Internews Ukraine, Kharkiv Institute for Social Research, and Cardiff University. People, thanks so much for joining us today as well. Vitaly Rybak, my colleague from Internews Ukraine, who has done the monitoring part of the report. And we will talk also about the key narratives behind this anti-Western propaganda in Ukraine. I think we'll cover lots of other issues as well. And Lyubov Tsibulska, who is the director of the Center for Strategic Communication and Information Security, a Ukrainian public institution, and we will discuss with Luba also how the state reacts to this issue. So, why conspiratorial propaganda works in Ukraine? What can we say about it? Peter, I will give the floor to you, maybe to present the key ideas, the key thoughts of this report.
Okay, thank you, Volodymyr. Thank you very much. So, putting it very simply, the essence of this report was to try and work out whether a new breed of Kremlin or Kremlin-aligned disinformation was working in Ukraine, but I think with relevance to a lot of other countries as well. So, very simply, as you know, it's hard for Kremlin propaganda to say how great Russia is all the time in Ukraine for obvious reasons. Even its kind of proxies like Mr. Medvedchuk, who was until recently a major media holder in Ukraine, would find that narrative hard to push, and especially hard to push, throughout Ukraine. So we've seen a shift. This was something that Volodya's team at Ukraine World and Internews identified a while ago, a shift towards narratives that aren't so much pro-Russian as anti-everyone else, anti-West, and infused with conspiratorial worldviews, for example, about George Soros, very familiar ones from across the world, ones which are more Soviet, I think, in their genealogy. The idea that there are hidden Western curators, Zapadny kuratorы, which I think resonates for people with a Soviet ear. And then sort of more kind of medical ones about sort of secret American biolabs being put in Ukraine to experiment on people. The aim of these narratives, I guess, is as we know, to not so much make Russia look great, but sort of equalize the West and Russia, undermine reforms, undermine trust. I think during the monitoring of these narratives, I mean, they were very, very prevalent on what were the Medvedchuk channels, for example, but you also find them on oligarchical channels who want to undermine the reforms process. A lot of these narratives are about how benign or positive seeming reforms are actually a way to exploit Ukraine and do it down. So I think what's nice about our project is we did the whole shebang from beginning to end, from monitoring, polling, which we did with the University of Zurich, and then focus groups, and of course recommendations, which are based on some insights, and I very much hope we'll get to try them one day. Cutting a long story short, and not getting sort of like caught up too much in the specific numbers, but what we're really seeing, and what's important, is that these narratives are leaving the usual pro-Russian bubble. So it's not a surprise that you're twice as likely to believe the narratives I mentioned if you watch Medvedchuk's channels, which is full of stories about how Sorosites are controlling Ukraine, how Ukraine is losing its sovereignty to the West. And Medvedchuk himself talks about biolabs, actually, American biolabs. I think you're much more likely to believe these narratives if you vote for the opposition party, and especially the sort of, the very strange party of Shari. We'd expect that, in some ways those narratives have replaced the older pro-Russian narratives that were present there. So that's not a huge surprise. It's a huge concern, but kind of like that doesn't make me go, wow. What I think is important is that these narratives are leaving that space. And I think a third of people, even in the west of the country, people who you'd expect to be super patriotic, are actually buying into them. In terms of parties, I mean, again, sizable amounts of voters for Sluga Naroda believe in these narratives. So that's very dangerous. The genie's out of the box. It's getting outside of the very dangerous limits that we had already. And so we then, it's also worth noting a couple of things that I think do reflect other studies elsewhere. This doesn't have much to do directly with education. Yeah. So people will believe these narratives across the educational spectrum. Yeah. It's kind of mixed in everywhere. Actually, the highest, but not much higher, were the unemployed and PhDs. Those were the two highest. And actually, having worked in universities doesn't surprise me. Get quite a lot of conspiracy theorists in universities. But look, this is an old thing. Conspiracy thinking is often a sign of a very active mind, of a very active imagination. So this is not new. Just judging from the polling, what matters much more is status. Are you in work? Are you doing well in life? Those sort of things do seem to reflect on the level of your belief. But listen, as you all know, we all deal with propaganda quite a lot. Polling, schmoling, especially in this bit of the world, you've got to do the focus groups, you've got to do the qual, because people's attitudes to media are actually very contradictory and very subtle. They may say they believe it, but actually they don't, but weirdly do. We know this from Russia, these sort of polls say, everybody believes Первый канал, and then nobody believes it. It's actually a weird bundle of emotions and feelings that people have. So I think in this sort of study, the actual magic happens in the focus groups and the qualitative work. So we were particularly interested, even though we talked to different social groups, we were particularly interested in sort of people in the west of the country who are you wouldn't expect to listen to pro-Russian propaganda. And again, a few strong things come out. Especially people in the regions, Western Ukraine, people who are strongly anti-Russian, patriotic, and so on. They are open to these narratives. And look, it's quite subtle. They can say, look, this smells like Russian propaganda. Yeah, we smell like Sorosites. It smells a bit like Russian propaganda. But it does feed into their deeper worldview. And that worldview is formed by, hundreds of years, but definitely a couple of decades of very, very harsh Ukrainian history. And it's a worldview that is very zero-sum, that sees the world full of malign actors, each trying to rip each other off. It's a worldview infused by people's personal experience. So people had terrible experiences of kind of robber banks in the 90s that cheated them. So now they use that to understand the IMF. Oh, the IMF are going to come and cheat us the way banks cheated us in the 90s. So there's these deep worldviews. There's a lot of cliches that people come up with, which are interesting because they repeat. They say things like, my favorite one, there is no cheese without a mousetrap. Actually, we should have actually called the report, there is no cheese without a mousetrap. So there's deep distrust of these narratives. Not of these narratives, of institutions, of Western institutions, of Kiev institutions, and just this sense we're about to get ripped off. That's very disturbing. I think those are the underlying conspiratorial mindsets that we need to work with. going back to the sociology, the quant, look, when we ask people the classic set of conspiratorial attitude questions that we ask in places like Hungary, do you believe there's secret organizations running the government? Ukraine is almost like twice as high as Hungary, which is quite high itself. Now, again, the border between conspiratorial thinking, skepticism, and sobriety is very thin. You were talking about a scale, skeptical, 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 whoops, we're off into conspiratorial land. I think the big test, by the way, is always whether people accept facts and evidence. You can convince a skeptic, you can't convince a conspiratorial thinker. So there's lots to play with. A lot of this is happening in this kind of gray zone. We're not talking about QAnon believers. We're talking about, I think, something that can be worked with. So I'd rather my colleague talked about the recommendations, but that's what we recommend, really. Government, international institutions, and Ukrainian media, think about how they can engage people, how they can gain trust. We know that trust is very low in Ukraine. So we put forward a bunch of very practical measures, types of media like engagement journalists, which engages people, and that's its point. It brings them into the newsrooms and asks them what they care about. It makes them feel empowered. And I think that empowered question is very, very important. I mean, that's one of the overriding things we found in the focus groups was that people who have a sense of their own empowerment are less open to these narratives. So I even there's a woman in a focus group sort of saying, I don't believe in conspiracy theories because I'm in charge of my own life. While people who are less empowered, who felt less in control, were more inclined. Again, we are not the first people to find this, and in a way, that's reassuring that we're seeing the same patterns. From a research point of view, it's good to see the same patterns everywhere. We make a bunch of recommendations to government, how they can engage people more. I think in the case of Ukraine, the whole question of how you can involve people through online political participation is interesting. There's a way forward there. Ukraine has promised to become a government and a smartphone. And it has all the capabilities for that. It's got decentralization, which makes it kind of possible on a bureaucratic level, on a procedural level. It's got an incredible IT industry that could push the envelope on the technology. And it has an existential need to build more resilience in society. I'll stop there. I mean, there are more recommendations, but that's kind of the arc of our project. Obviously, there's much more in the 50 pages with a very, very smart cover that is, we feel now, is being censored by the Facebook algorithm because it suggests that we're the conspiracy theorists. Yeah, I think is that okay, Volodya? Did you want more? Is that good?
Oh, yeah, of course I want more from you, but maybe a little bit later. Yes. Thank you so much, Peter. I would just address Inna, and we'll try to develop certain topics that you touched upon. I think that one of the issues that strikes me in the way how we worked with focus groups, how we asked people, is this sense of empowerment that Peter mentioned. Is that indeed it doesn't mean that Ukrainians feel lack of empowerment at all. They feel a certain level of empowerment, individual agency, but it doesn't translate into kind of a collective agency. So it's like, I'm in charge of my life, I'm in control of my life, but everything that goes beyond this little circle is monstrous, unclear, I don't have trust to it. Do you have the same impression?
Well, I have mixed feelings, and since we were researching different segments of Ukrainian audience, we also found different moods, in different segments. But yes, people who feel themselves more financially secured in this life, who are living in the central Ukraine, in Kiev, in big cities, other big cities in Ukraine, they are more empowered. They do have bigger control over their own life, and sometimes they feel that they can influence also the state. But even they can search for an explanation of something broader than Ukraine. So they are looking, as Peter mentioned, so people with high education, engineers, people who think that there is some system, there should be some system. They are looking the explanation. So what the part of the system Ukraine is, and sometimes they found this explanation, unfortunately, in different conspiracy theories and propaganda.
Yeah, it's interesting how Ukrainians actually, whom we faced in focus groups, are globally thinking. So I was thinking rather about Ukrainians as being too much focused on our internal reality. They try to think globally, to think about the world, but this picture of the world is quite simplistic.
I think it's also about feeling yourself stronger than you are. It's cool to think that your personal vis-a-vis is Soros or someone else, someone as big and powerful as, I don't know, these Western curators without names. That you are equal because they are fighting you, and the battlefield of I don't know, worldview, Western or Russian, is in Ukraine. It also raises you higher in your own eyes. That you are very, very important.
But it's very interesting that pro-Russian propaganda has shifted its focus from saying that Russia is good to saying that the West is bad. And it's interesting how, when we were trying to think how to conceptualize it, right? There was lots of discussion inside the team whether we should use the word West, because in the West itself,
right,
it doesn't, you know, the idea of collective West has probably fallen apart. I don't know, but we are talking about different players, etc. But for these propagandists, it is still, there is something like collective West. They're using this word "западный куратор," etc. So it's interesting how it's, you know, it's coming back from Soviet times, but with a
little
different,
bit Cold War flavor, yeah.
A bit Cold War flavor. They understand that they will not be able to attract attention with saying that Russia is good, because distrust to Russia is very high in Ukrainian society. But I think what we understood is that it's not like you are pro-Western or you are pro-Russian. It's much, sometimes it's much deeper, more complicated, and you have lots of, you know, fields of the society which are feeling themselves patriotic, pro-Ukrainian, but still are saying that the West is bad, the Western curators are bad. What do you think?
I think Kremlin just diversifies the messages, and since we were focusing mostly or only on anti-Western propaganda, which is a hidden pro-Kremlin propaganda automatically, because it makes West as bad as Russia in these narratives. But there is another part of narratives, and monitoring of our colleagues from Detector Media, from Institute of Mass Information, shows that it's more or less equal, like 50% of the pro-Kremlin narratives are still praising Russia as a good alternative to the rest of the world. So they just, this is, let's say, this is a season special proposal for summer, or not for summer, because we were studying our research in the end of last year. But it's a smart virus which just finds new messages according to the news agenda. And when pandemic started, the big part of this narrative started to are dedicated to vaccination, to Sputnik, to the nature of this virus, to the biolabs which kind of exist in Ukraine, and where Russia, or where Western society is testing vaccines on Ukrainians and so on. They're very flexible, they're very quick, and they use different channels and different topics to convince the audience that West is bad and Russia is the only alternative. And also, of course, the main goal of this anti-Western propaganda is to undermine the reforms in our country, and just to put this gap between us and the European Union, between US, and by default put us closer to Russia.
Let me ask my colleague Vitaly Rybak, who is now online. He was responsible for this monitoring part of our work, but I will not ask you, Vitaly, to focus on the key narratives, because they are in the report, and I really advise to our listeners to look into the report itself, which is available on the website of ARENA, Public Journalism Interest Lab, and Ukraine World. But Vitaly, can you develop a story where these narratives are migrating right now, when we know that Medvedchuk channels, for example, are sanctioned? What is happening with them?
Yeah, right. So what strikes me really the most about these narratives is that they're really flexible and adaptable towards different platforms or mediums, because people who launch these narratives understand that different age groups basically consume different media and get news from various sources. Meaning, for instance, in Ukraine, people like 40 plus years old are still getting news like from uh, evening news on TV, and young people like 25, 30 years, they are now mostly getting news from social networks of or news websites, but mainly from social networks. And we also see that such social networks as, for instance, Telegram are rising. So people are migrating from traditional media such as print outlets, TV, or even traditional news websites to these social networks in which basically everyone can promote their own agenda, in which, if we talk about Telegram, one can create an anonymous channel and publish information framed as insights from the government, and people trust this information. They subscribe to these channels, and that's really one of the most dangerous places because, uh, as we know from February this year, some of these anonymous Telegram channels, the largest ones, are controlled from Russia, but they position themselves as independent Ukrainian media outlets. So that's really a huge problem. Still, we
Yeah,
also have, yeah.
yeah, the Telegram is obviously is a very interesting thing, like a social network, which is very linear, and which gives you an impression that you're in touch with some hidden information. Let me also ask Lubov Cybulska, who is the director of the Stratcom Center in Ukraine. What is, how do you estimate the situation right now with this anti-Western propaganda? Do you think that it's really a security threat right now to Ukraine? Because Russia is seen mostly with a great deal of mistrust, but we see other options which are used, by pro-Russian players to undermine trust, not only in Ukraine as a political entity, but also its integration with the EU and the West.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me today. It's a great research. It's very valuable, and I hope that not just experts from our echo chamber will read this research. In our echo chamber, again, we usually laugh at conspiracy theories. We jokingly call ourselves Sarasata, and we joke that chips are inserted in our brains when we get vaccinated. And the truth is actually very disturbing and sad. People really believe in conspiracy theories. And of course, conspiracy is something that has been there for centuries, and it's especially drives and thrives in times of crisis. So no wonder we have it, especially now during the pandemic. But also conspiracy theories especially emphasize the importance of quality basic education, what Peter mentioned already, including schools, and obviously this aspect requires more strategic approach. What are the main motives that drive people and make them believe conspiracy? Psychological researches shows that there are three sets of motives. First one, epistemic, it's about need for some knowledge and certainty. And when something major happens, people naturally want to know why that happened. And they want an explanation, and they want to know the truth, but they also want to feel certain of that truth. So people with lower level of education tend to be drawn to conspiracy theories. And we do not argue that because people are not intelligent. It's simply that they haven't been allowed to have or haven't been given access to those tools to differentiate between good sources and bad sources, or credible sources or non-credible sources. So they're looking for that knowledge and certainty, but not necessarily looking in the right places. The second motive, it's about existential. needs. There is a need to feel safe and secure, and also to feel that there is some kind of power, as you said, Volodymyr, or power or autonomy over the things that happens to people. And of course, when something happens, people don't want to feel powerless, and they don't like to feel out of control. And the final set of motives we would call social motives, and those refer to people's desire to feel good about themselves as individuals. And they like to have high self-esteem, of course, and they like to feel to know that they can provide some information to other people and to connect with other people with this information. And conspiracy, largely, as we all identified, gives people a sense of security. And the security is a very large Russian propaganda narratives. Russian propaganda machine works very skillfully with this narrative. Democracy is insecurity, the Russian propaganda tells us. And we at UCMC, when I worked for UCMC, once we did a study called Image of Europe in Russian Media. And we literally calculated all negative mentions of all European countries. And we figured out that the most popular narrative was the horror of lives. This narrative included all the news about how dangerous it is to live in Europe. Wherever a European citizen goes, it hides danger. Democracy doesn't work. It doesn't give you security. And this is the signal given by Russian propaganda. And the second most popular narrative, by the way, was the protest narrative. According to the Kremlin news, everyone in the European Union is protesting. Protests of janitors, of doctors, of workers of Eiffel Tower, and so on. We even tried to see if there was at least 1 week when Russian TV channels, state-controlled and state-orchestrated channels, didn't talk about the protest. But no, that was not the case. And it is permanent, ongoing narrative designed to show that Europeans are always dissatisfied, that their system, the democratic system, is so imperfect that people are forced, they have to protest. So what should the government do? First of all, work with this security narrative and democracy narrative. And in our center, we just developed a set of strategic pro-Ukrainian. It's actually very weird to say pro-Ukrainian. I've never heard pro-Poland narratives or pro-Czech narratives, but we usually say pro-Ukrainian narratives about and pro-Ukrainian forces in Ukraine. So we developed a set of this narrative jointly with the NGOs, and I'm very grateful to you, Volodya, that you contributed to this work. And now these narratives are going to be tested by focus groups, and then hopefully we will have information campaigns, and all ministries will include these narratives in their communications.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Luba. Thank you. Let's continue this topic that you raised because we would like to really focus upon the issue, what we can do about it. And our report also has sets of recommendations. I will ask Ina and Peter to develop on it a little bit. So what can media do about it? What can government do about it? What can international organizations do about it? Ina?
I think Peter already mentioned that empowering is the key, and this empowering can be made by different stakeholders, including the state, including the media. If we are talking about the media, since I'm from the Public Interest Journalism Lab, and we are studying the different models of modern, efficient, constructive journalism, we are talking about showing the kitchen, just showing how the news are made, to engage your audience into agenda setting, into news creation, into article, to focus on the needs of your audience and to give a floor for voices of your audience in your media, online media or TV media, like to make it just a little bit closer, and to fight the myth that someone unknown curators are writing this news on Ukraine. If we are talking about the state, it's also about empowering the citizens with concrete instruments how they can influence their daily life, and also explaining the reforms. So conspiracy works because people are looking for an explanation what's going on. So let's do not just fight fakes, but let's do explain why these reforms are in process actually, what impact they make on your daily life, what you will see in 3 years, what is the cost of not doing these reforms, what we will lose if we do not do this right now, and to explain every step. Yes, let it be a lot of information, but let people do not like imagine themselves something or believe into different rumors. Let them the sources of credible information, how they can have this communication, two-ways communication, not only vertical down, but also asking questions and getting different answers. For our as an NGO, yes, I think it's very important to continue media literacy campaigns, and maybe even to start with the younger audience, like moving to the schools education programs, and to explain, to teach how you can understand that it's manipulation or not. And critical thinking is very important as a skill of a person in 21st century. And of course, to our Western partners, and again to the Ukrainian power authorities, it's important to explain that Ukraine can be interested for the world not as an object, but as a subject of geopolitics. And even when we are talking about reforms, and our research shows that Ukrainians are quite skeptical about Western support of reforms because they are looking for some hidden interests. No, we need also to stress, to point that Ukrainians, as an intellectuals, as the vibrant civil society, we can produce our own solutions which can be applicable abroad. We can export not only the problems and to be a troublemaker in the Europe who doesn't allow Western countries to have friendship with Russia, which is economically very profitable sometimes. No, we can really be a solution, and we can be in avant-garde of solving global threats to democracy in general.
That's for Ukrainians is very, very important, that what we understood from the focus groups, understanding that you can influence also others and export something in a good sense of the term.
Right.
But I think one of the key issues that we understood, maybe you will agree with me, right, is that you cannot really fight propaganda with only debunking or fact-checking. That's a very important task, but it's only one part of the iceberg. What we call narratives, strategic narratives, it's just also the part of communication, because if you fight against, disinformation, you should place something instead of it, on the place of it, right? And it's media literacy, narratives, and all this stuff is very, very important. Let me come back to Peter. If you are with us, maybe you can reflect upon the global setting. What is reflection right now in the global, in the global context, and how Ukrainian experience can contribute to it. But before you answer, let me address to our audience. If you have some questions, please put them into the chat or behind this broadcast, beyond this. Under this broadcast, and we also have a couple of questions already. I would like to raise them. If you want to raise the question in person, please raise your hand, and my colleagues will inform me about that. So, Peter, what is the global setting of these issues, and how is the reflection about solving this issue in global setting is going on?
So look, I think the one side positive effect of the Trump years was that there was a growing awareness that this is a huge issue in, in all sorts of markets, not just in the cliche of developing countries. This isn't a developing country problem. The most mature democracies are seeing this, and we could talk at length about the underlying trends of why that's happening. I think it has a lot to do with uncertainty, the upending of old identities. I think conspiracy theories play a strong role in creating identities when old identities have become unstable and explaining a world that's very chaotic and confusing. That's happening everywhere. We have to stop seeing this as here are the wise developed countries and here are the infantile Eastern Europeans or something. It's everywhere. It's been mainstreamed. That's the really scary thing. It's no longer a niche issue. It's something that we see coming from the center of society in many countries. So I think I think the only difference with Ukraine is that it's an existential issue because it's connected to Ukraine's survival. That makes it sharper. And that's why I think maybe we can pioneer some of the solutions in Ukraine. There's been some small academic research into what you can do online if you give warnings before conspiracies, before people see the conspiracy content, if you get some sort of warning, does that mitigate it? And that does play some sort of role. A lot of people just getting pulled into this stuff. So there are delays you can put in. There's a bit of research on that, but and that's important, introducing that sort of friction that might mitigate some stuff around this. I do think you have to address the underlying issues and the worldviews that the conspiracy plays on. That's what we're proposing. But look, I mean, what we really need is a lot of things like PIJL. What I love about PIJL, the sort of our partners in this project, is that they unite content creation and social research. That's very rare. Most journalists are just oh, we found our niche audiences. Let's just blast things at them because we'll know that'll become profitable at one point, or at least we'll break even. Nobody's thinking about, okay, how do I reach the really difficult to reach audience? I mean, the BBC is a little bit, but they're the only institution that are really set up for this. So certainly no one in many markets is. So I think PIGL are completely unique. What we need is a sprouting of PIGL-like organizations across the world that are doing journalism, not PR, not marketing, not strategic communication, which is a word that always makes me laugh, but doing journalism as well, engaging people, bringing them into this lovely phrase from Jay Rosen at New York University, sort of letting a public, helping a public appear by creating content that makes people engaged in democracy. Not getting them what to think, not packaging, but actually, reaching out and bringing them in. But those are very grand and romantic words. What we need is years and years of intense research to do that. We need to be doing it in different countries simultaneously. I'd love to doing a project, Ukraine, US, India, comparing. What are we finding? What's unique? Because some things will be unique, but what are the consistencies? So at the moment, there's little sustained research like that I've seen. There's little bits here and there, but we need something more sustained. I think there's now a recognition that this is a crisis.
Thank you, Peter. We now have questions from the audience. There is a question from Jeff Trimble. I would read it. Excellent event and report. Conspiracist is used in discussions such as this one in a pejorative manner, given the reality that so many people, including those who tend to think more deeply about issues, subscribe to some sort of conspiracy thinking. Can this be turned into a positive direction? For example, from an accusation into a more welcoming approach that respects the skepticism that people are expressing. Peter, can you answer this question?
So I think you're getting at something very important, Jeff. One of the things that we always look to do, and kind of our approach through social research always underlines this, is that we've got to stop putting people in bundles. The Fox News viewer, go and explore them. There's maybe 20% crazies and 80% who are engageable. The conspiracists. So that's kind of what we're trying to say in this research. They're very contradictory. They know it's bullshit, but they're drawn to it because it reflects something deeper. I do think there's a way of drawing the line, though. It's always a scale, conspiratorial thinking. We always do it on a scale, by the way. We never go yes or no. But for me, there is a line as almost like as a journalist, and actually as someone who wants to stay sane. Which conversation do I continue, and which one do I give up on? The the ones that you give up on are when people have stopped admitting evidence. Yeah, when they say, I dismiss this evidence because you're CIA, which maybe you've had flung at you, Jeff, if you were, BBG associated for a while. That's very hard to deal with. That's already kind of almost like that's a different stage. There you've really got to go even deeper into, deep problems and almost one-to-one work, yeah? But as long as people are saying, oh, evidence, interesting, well, it contradicts what I heard and I'm so uncertain, but I see this as evidence, and they admit to evidence being something that you can have a conversation around, then I think there's hope, because there's still that common set of paradigms that we can operate with. By the way, some friends at University of Venice were looking at anti-vax conspiracies. There again, they said, look, don't put them into one thing. I'm going to use the word, there's people for whom it's a mental health issue, essentially, yeah? There's people with anti-vaxxers who just had a really bad experience with the doctor once. We saw that in the US, in Baltimore and places where people were scared to take the vaccine because there was a history of, a very bad relationship between the hospital and the Afro-American community. You've got to get into that, you've got to start doing it, and where you can find ways of working. And if 20% are lost, I mean, I don't know whether it's worth spending that much energy on that part, but let's start cleaving them away. Let's start getting those who can engage. And you're right, finding a different word is so important. Skeptics, yeah, I don't know. But then we have climate skepticism. That's been reversed the other way already, because we have climate skepticism, which was hacked by the kind of conspiracists. So there's a war for language that we need to think about that's probably already happening.
Thank you, Peter. To follow up on this issue, I think in Ukrainian context, we can also think about how to engage these topics that propaganda is raising. For example, it is raising the question of increase of tariffs, of gas tariffs, or it's raising the questions of economic inequality. And it will be very bad if, for example, by accepting that this is part of propaganda, we're not addressing this issue. We're not trying to engage these questions, because often they're relating to the issues of economic welfare. Well, people are poor. And of course, if journalism, if state communication does not engage into these issues, then we're in big trouble. What do you think?
I think that we should explain, because this propaganda works, it is effective because there's a request for these topics, and it means that we do not need only to tackle the myths and fakes. This is one separate part of work, but the second, a very important part of work which should be constantly in process, is explaining every action, every decision, every idea, every reforms, and just to model it, to show what will happen and why it's needed, and to make reforms equal to security, because Ukrainians feel insecure, quite insecure, also because of financial issues and war, of course. And we need to explain that these reforms are very needed for us as a state to succeed, and to have back our people and our territories which are temporarily occupied.
Thank you. We had a comment by Andrew Wilson. Andrew, hello, good to see you. Maybe you would like to take the floor and say it. What do you think?
Oh, it was just a technical question, Volodya. I'd previously read this report by guys who are part of your consortium, yeah? And their figures looked a little bit different, 20 to 30% believing the main narratives. So is it the same research data? Could you explain it?
Can you explain
Which exactly narrative, yeah?
Huh?
Which exactly narrative?
What exactly do you mean? What report, what other report, and what other narrative?
Well, there's a link to the piece that I found online in the chat. It's by CSS in Switzerland. I think
exactly. Yeah, they did the polling. Exactly. Yeah. Sorry, maybe we should explain this better. So we did the media monitoring and the focus groups, and the polling comes exactly from Zurich, from University of Zurich.
I think, Andrew, we just in our figures we combined people who definitely think this way, for example, that Ukraine is under the influence of Western curators, and who tend to think in this way. So if you combine these figures, you will have the figure of 40%, for example. So the report, the quantitative report, is made by Zurich University. We refer to it, yeah, as Peter said, we just try to understand what is behind these figures in the qualitative way. Let me also read the question from Joanna. Did your research consider interest in politics as a variable? Most evidence I've seen suggests that complete disinterest in politics is quite common in Ukraine. This may complicate the recommended task of empowering people by informing them and giving them opportunities to engage in.
Volodya, what do you think of it?
Do I think? Yeah, but first, well, I think that the interest in politics in Ukraine is like wave-like, yeah, right? So we have lots of interest during the elections, for example, and then the drop of interest in 1 year or 2 years after the election, for example, the presidential election, whatever. So we have like, I would call it kind of an uneven distribution of trust in politics. So the huge level of mistrust to politicians, for example, and then there is a huge belief that one politician, let's say Zelensky or Zelensky 2.0, will fix this. And then we have like very high upraising in this trust in politicians, and then very low drop. Do you have this impression as well?
Well, the last 8 years I was watching, I was a watchdog towards elected authorities, and we were working a lot with politicians, with politics, and with policies. And I think that Ukrainian society is too much politicized, really. Political talk shows are even more important. It's the way of talent shows. It's the kind of talent shows in Ukraine. Every channel has few of them. And my parents, for example, they're just switching these channels, and they know all of these faces I've never seen, but who actually share some conspiratorial, very often, messages with them. I think Ukrainians have traditionally very high expectations on every new opposition. And then once they become the authority, they do not deliver the result. They show with their actions something very opposite to what they promised. And the level of disappointment usually is very high after a few months. What we see now is the evolution of Ukrainians as electorates, as those who elect the authorities. Because sometimes they call it honeymoon, but the honeymoon of Zelensky is the longest that any other Ukrainian president or political party had. He is still seen and perceived by Ukrainians as the legal representative of their interests, and they do support what his political force and his personnel doing, because they do trust him somehow. Maybe they see some similarities, maybe they do see the difference, or maybe they understand that like this is not a professional politician. It means that maybe he is not as bad as the previous one we had. So but this level of general mistrust into institutions, it of course multiplies into certain coefficient all actions by these authorities. And we had another interesting research made by a lab on vaccination. And it's super interesting that Ukrainians who are skeptical towards anti-COVID vaccination in Ukraine, they would be happy to have it abroad. So they do not mind to make it in Poland or somewhere in EU, but they do not believe in, for example, the way this vaccine was procured and delivered, or how this
so
procedure
it's not
is
about
organized.
Vaccination as
It's
such.
not. Yeah,
it's about.
It's a complex. It's
yeah.
a complex approach, and we do have to work also in complex on this anti-Western, pro-Russian propaganda, different directions.
Let me ask Luba Cybulska, because it's also like a continuation of this issue, what the government can do, because the question of Joanna is also refers to a big question whether we can engage our citizens and whether we can have a equal kind of communication with them. I think that's what Peter is trying to say, that we should communicate with our citizens as adults, not as infants, for example. But in Ukraine, how do you perceive this situation? Do people really want to be engaged? Do people really want to increase their agency level?
I think that people do want to be engaged, and the decentralization reforms perfectly shows that people are actually very interested in taking actions and taking initiative. So it's just, I think it's more matter of quality of communication, and it was very good example how our government communicated vaccination. And unfortunately, we have to admit, and I wrote a lot of pieces about this, a lot of articles, that it should be done more strategically. Our government had thought about had to thought about this issue before the vaccine was invented. So it's just very important to see this communication a strategic thing, and of course to make it really understandable for people. So I'm completely sure that our citizens wants to be engaged, but yeah, there is some sort of tiredness, and we see that people are overloaded by some topics like politics or economy or coronavirus. There are researchers that show that they do not want to read information or watch information about the pandemic anymore. And yes, that it means also that we kind of lost this moment in terms of government communication.
Thank you, Luba. Thank you for raising this issue. I would like probably to come to a certain conclusion, and I will ask Inna and Peter maybe comment if you agree with me or not. So what we basically understood from this research, let me repeat myself, right, is that it's somehow about the issue of propaganda, disinformation, malinformation. It's not only an issue about facts and fact checking. It's about the way how you work with the traumas of people, how you work with the values, how you work with the sense of agency, mindsets, worldviews. And it doesn't mean that, for example, society have to think, or government has to think how to form them in a particular way. But the key thing is to create conditions where people will try to themselves enlarge the sense of the agency. The more in control you are of your life, the lesser probability will be that you will believe that the Soros is in control of your life. And the problem of Ukraine is that I think that the number of people who are feeling that not only they are in control of their life, but for example they can influence the reality of their city, of their town, of the country, or of the world, for example, is very limited. And that's the problem. What do you think?
I think that the work with mindset and values is like a prevention. And from the medical healthcare reform, we know that we need to invest into prevention, not into treating patients at the later stage of disease. So yes, it's in parallel again and again. We need to create mechanisms, create a communication type, constantly running, which will just make impossible spreading of some very obvious manipulative information. It's about changing educational programs, it's about two-way communication with your authorities, it's about empowering citizens with some digital instruments of democracy, it's about engaging your audience if you are a media. So it's a complex work, and some of this work is already in process, some should be launched, and I think in general it will introduce us a lot of solutions which can be applicable abroad.
Good. Let's hope. Peter, you want to add something?
Sorry, am I muted?
No.
Oh, you can hear me. Well, that's weird. Okay, fine. Um, I think. Look, I think the key is really trying to sort of build international sort of research on this topic, and consistency. Those are kind of my priorities moving forward. And really, I always come back to this when I think about Ukraine. That sort of, I really want to stop seeing Ukraine as some sort of kind of, I don't want to use the wrong word, but some sort of anomaly. I really do think the processes going on in Ukraine are at the avant-garde of things that we're seeing everywhere, and has to be framed that way as well.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you to all of you who were watching us. This was a discussion by Ukraine World and Internews Ukraine around our report, Why Conspiratorial Propaganda Works in Ukraine, what to do with this. This report was prepared by Arena think tank, by Public Journalism Interest Lab, Internews Ukraine, Kharkiv Institute for Social Research, Cardiff University. We had Inna Borzilo, who is a co-founder of Public Journalism Interest Lab. We had Peter Pomerantsev, as a well-known scholar and expert and director of the Arena think tank. Lyubov Cybulska, director of Ukrainian Stratcom, the Center for Strategic Communications. Vitaly Rybak, who is expert at Internews Ukraine and Ukraine World. I think I mentioned everybody. Thanks so much for watching this, and read our report on the website ukraineworld.org, on the website of Public Journalism Interest Lab and Arena think tank. Thank you.
Thank you.